Good afternoon, everyone. Can people hear me at the back? Can I just check? Is that good? Okay, excellent. Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first annual McKeon Center Lecture. My name is Joel Isaac, and I am the faculty director of the McKeon Center here at the University of Chicago. As many of you will know, the center is named in honor of the philosopher and educator Richard McKeon. McKeon had a long and storied career at the University of Chicago, where he was a transformational dean of the humanities division and an equally transformational teacher of both undergraduates and graduate students. He was also a distinguished scholar of rhetoric and of the history of philosophy. His writings in these fields cover everything from the ancient world to the cutting-edge thought of his own time. The McKeon Center has many initiatives underway that seek to build on McKeon's legacy as both an educator and a scholar. And I urge all of you, this is my plug, I urge all of you, if you have not done so already, to consult our website for information on fellowship programs, reading groups, conferences, and other events. In one of his rare forays into autobiography, McKeon described three problems that had occupied his attention throughout his career. The first was the unity of knowledge. The second was the challenge of teaching the liberal arts in the modern world. And the third was what he called intercultural relations. As was his way, McKeon did not see these as three separate problems, but as deeply implicated in one another, both conceptually and historically. In philosophy, McKeon observed, the writings of Aristotle, Spinoza, and his own PhD advisor, John Dewey, had raised the all-important question of what the basis might be for the unity of knowledge and inquiry. For McKeon, what mattered was less the particular answers these philosophers gave to the question of unity, and more the fact that they showed how the problem could be addressed. In addition, the question of the unity of knowledge was not only for McKeon an epistemological or metaphysical one. It was also a question of pedagogy, of the formation of souls able to grasp truth. This practical bent drew McKeon to the issues of education, not just for college students, but for the public at large. As early as 1930, he envisaged a modern reconstruction of the trivium with its classic subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. In turn, the problem of the unity of knowledge and of the education proper to prepare oneself to tackle that problem also bore on the matter of intercultural relations. The two world wars through which McKeon had lived, he actually served in World War I as well, had forced the question of world order onto the agenda. And this was not just a political problem for McKeon, but one, as I've said, of communication across cultures, which McKeon sought to foster through his work at UNESCO and at the International Institute for Philosophy. It has become clear to us at the center that not only are these issues as relevant today as they were in McKeon's own time, but that we should have a dedicated lecture each year in which the central questions of philosophy, the liberal arts, pedagogy, and intercultural communication are opened up by our leading scholars and thinkers. To that end, I can think of no one better to inaugurate this series than Anthony Grafton, the Henry Putnam University Professor of History Emeritus at Princeton. Professor Grafton is, simply put, one of the great historians of our time, one whose range and erudition has few equals. His field is the cultural and intellectual history of Renaissance Europe, yet this description hardly begins to capture the range of his interests. His research spans the history of science, philosophy, scholarship, art, education, and architecture, from antiquity to the modern era. He has explored how the thought and culture of the classical civilizations, most especially, although not only, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, were revived, reworked, and reimagined during the long flourishing of European humanism from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Tony is the author of at least 10 books, and the co-author, editor, co-editor, or translator of 9 more. Some of these have been landmark works of intellectual biography, such as his 2-volume study of the classical scholar of the Renaissance, Joseph Scaliger, or his books on the astrologer Girolamo Cardano, the painter and architect Leon Battista Alberti, and the Hebrew and Aramaic scholar Johann Buxtorf. Other works of Tony's have delved into the broad development of scholarship, education, bookmaking, and the liberal arts in early modern Europe. If you can indulge me, I must make special reference to Tony's delightful history of the footnote, which was the first Grafton text that I published from a bookstore in Greenwich, London in the year 2000. It showed me how the history of scholarship could be both dazzlingly illuminating and terrific fun at the same time, so it has a special place on my own bookshelves. Among Tony's many awards and honors are the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Bolzan Prize for the History of the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation's Distinguished Achievement Award, and the Barry Prize for Distinguished Intellectual Achievement from the American Academy of Sciences and Letters. He is a member of the American Philosophical Society and of the British Academy. In 2011, he served as the president of the American Historical Association. I could continue in this vein, but let me simply add one more very important item to the list of Tony's achievements. He is, as some of you may be aware, the holder of a BA, an MA, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. His biography of Scaliger began as his dissertation here in the Department of History under the supervision of Eric Cochrane. Hence, in welcoming Tony here this evening, we are also welcoming him back to at least one of his academic homes. One logistical note before I hand over to Tony. There will be time at the end of the lecture for questions. Then, beginning at 6 p.m., there'll be a reception just outside the lecture hall here, across the way there with views of campus, to which you are all warmly invited. I should say something else about Q&A. Because we are recording this lecture, I need to hand the person asking a question a microphone. Do not start asking your question until the microphone is in your hand. Otherwise, the video will not record your brilliant intervention. So please wait until you have the microphone in your hand, and I'll try and keep a queue. The last thing I want to say of a logistical nature is that Tony very kindly has agreed to lead a seminar on Thursday, April 2nd, from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. in Gates Blake 133. Full information is on the website. There are readings assigned, an article of Tony's and a primary source for discussion, and that's on Thursday. So please do come. Again, you're all warmly invited, but please register if you do plan on coming. Okay, so among Tony's current book projects is a history of a form of historical writing known as conjectural history. Often considered a genre of the 18th century, and as the seedbed of both historical materialism and the social sciences, conjectural history, as Tony will show us, I believe, has both deeper and wider roots in the Renaissance. The title of his lecture today is The Rhetorical Tradition and Conjectural History in Early Modern Europe. A question mal posée? Tony, welcome.
Thank you all for coming, and heartfelt thanks to have this chance to expose work very much in progress to the legendarily bent nibs of a University of Chicago audience. Coming to speak here, for those who know the place, is a little bit like being John Scotus on that legendary bad day when his students sharpened their nibs a little too much. Thanks also to Joel Isaac for the very generous invitation to deliver this lecture, to Atya Singh, Nick, and John, and the others who have made all the arrangements so seamless that my PowerPoint even worked, which is not something on which one can always rely. And of course, more generally, to the University of Chicago, which I still think of as my home. I arrived here at 17, ignorant, terrified, and confused, and left some years later, still ignorant, terrified, and confused, but at least on the way to trying to do something about that. And I like to think back on my wonderful teachers here, Hannah Gray, Eric Cochrane, Noel Swerdlow, Arnaldo Momidiano, and many others. I'm also delighted to address the subject of this talk and this center, because rhetoric in all its forms and avatars has never been more central, more important to scholarship or to public discourse than it is at this moment when crises of so many kinds afflict it, and it's so difficult to know how to practice it in a constructive way. And finally, it's a great honor to speak in a lecture named for Richard McKeon. I didn't have the good fortune to study with Richard McKeon. In fact, I was too scared, and I was not the only one. But when I arrived here, his works were literally everywhere. From the introduction to Aristotle and the selections from medieval philosophers, which played vital roles in that time, at least still in general education, to his eye-opening studies on the history and meaning of rhetoric, which I read as greedily as I avoided making personal contact. This was the time when rhetoric was being rediscovered, and bliss was it to be alive in those days. We had courses on rhetoric. Hannah Gray herself was a specialist in it and taught us a great deal about it. Visitors like Walter Ong, who came from a remarkable term here, taught us more. And Professor McKeon, by his writing, if not in my case, by his presence, taught us an incredible amount. And I would just like to cite one article, a mind-blowing article that appeared in Speculum in 1942. You may find it hard to believe that a mind-blowing article could have appeared in Speculum in 1942. In fact, it was one of the rather large crop of extraordinary little masterpieces of scholarship, which in those days illuminated the pages of humanistic scholarly journals. The works of people like Ernst Kantorowicz, Paul Christeller, Marjorie Nicholson, Naldo Momidiano. And there really was then a culture of the article which an ordinary person could have used the material from to write 3 books, but it was better as the article. And in this case, it's Rhetoric in the Middle Ages, modestly titled. And just an extraordinary piece. It covers a dizzying range of aspects of rhetoric, students of rhetoric, practitioners of rhetoric, users of rhetoric, in each case with a wonderful combination of insight and precision. One of its findings came as a dazzling and for me very important revelation. Most of my reading, until I came across McKeon's piece, had treated rhetoric as an art of composition and production, a guide for composing texts, which were, as oratorical texts, designed to move, to please, to persuade, to appear in a published context. McKeon showed that it was also no less centrally an art of interpretation. Rhetoric offered principles for the examination, classification, and clarification of texts. They were applied eagerly and systematically to works as vital as the scriptures and the writings of the fathers. When Peter Abelard, McKeon says, assembled apparently contradictory texts in his Sic et Non, Yes and No, the book that McKeon, with a collaborator, actually managed to finish editing just at the very end of his career. A wonderful text. The rules for interpreting them, which he set forth in the prologue, involve such directions as careful consideration of context, comparison of text, specification of time, place, and person, determination of original sense of statement, differentiation of general measures from particular. Although this method led to a further step, indeed many further steps, at this stage it is rhetorical. Indeed it was. Logic might rule rather than rhetoric in the schools and universities of the Middle Ages, but that logic actually incorporated rhetoric and rhetorical principles, as McKeon showed at length. For me, the discovery that rhetoric was as much hermeneutical as homiletical was a real mind-blower, and it has kept me busy ever since. So this point, applied in McKeon's article to theology and his own central fields of the 12th and 13th centuries, has found wider applications over the generations since he wrote it. One is in Kathy Eden's wonderful work on the humanistic tradition of hermeneutics, based, as she shows, on rhetorical principles. Another was made by that great historian Carlo Ginzburg, who followed this track in a different direction. He showed that the analytic mode of rhetoric played a central role in the work of that most brilliant, original, and provocative of Renaissance scholars, Lorenzo Valla. Valla's fame and his position in textbooks rests almost entirely on a single work, the Phosphorescent Polemic, in which he exposed the donation of Constantine, a long-established couple of forgeries which showed how the Emperor Constantine, grateful to Pope Sylvester, who had cured him of leprosy, gave him the Western Roman Empire and went off to found New Rome and build a new Roman Empire in the East. Valla's text is often described as a work of history, but it actually isn't a work of history. He himself was in no doubt about that. He called it an oration. In fact, he called it an oratiuncula, a little oration. And no modest man either. He wrote to a friend, "Never have I written anything more oratorical than this oration." And this was true for a couple of reasons, partly because of the phosphorescent vituperation with which he condemned the idiots who thought that the 4th century Roman Empire had included satraps and that its emperors had worn Phrygian tiaras. But more importantly, as Ginsburg said, because the systematic examination and refutation of evidence that he engaged in the body of the text was also part of the rhetorical training that he had and that he offered to his students. This is Valla's manuscript of the Roman rhetorician Quintilian, from the section in which Quintilian talks about the rhetorician learning how to support or refute evidence and uses historical evidence as an example. And you see Valla there saying, in typical Valla fashion, yes, this question can also be raised in ecclesiastical matters, as about Susanna, Tobit, Judith, and also about ecclesiastical histories, such as that of St. George, and of many others, where there are many grounds for rejecting them. So Valla was in no doubt that the rejection of the donation of Constantine came as an application of his own rhetorical training and the rhetorical training that he offered to others. This is really one of Ginsburg's greatest discoveries, and I think a truly wonderful piece of work. This lecture is really a sprig from the great trees of McKeon, Eden, and Ginsburg, and some others, but in it I'll try to advance what I hope is a novel argument in their spirit, that Renaissance humanists and historians, often using ancient materials, constructed vital parts of what would become conjectural history, and that most of these came from the rhetorical tradition. Now, the term conjectural history usually conjures up people and scenes far removed from the Renaissance. Intellectual historians use it usually to designate a new form of historical writing, created, they often, though not always say, in the second half of the 18th century in Scotland by Adam Smith and others. It was very exciting, at least in the second half of the 18th century in Scotland and even beyond. Dugald Stewart, who was one of the creators of conjectural history, but who also wrote the canonical history of it, in which he gave the leading role to Adam Smith. Dugald Stewart said of conjectural history, "It is the peculiar glory of the later half of the 18th century." Few historians have ever quite claimed quite that much. These writers traced the development of human society and culture, as we would now say, in early periods for which they had no documentary or monumental evidence, and also in more recent ones for which they could make almost anything their evidence. Dugald Stewart's dissertation, which is a kind of intellectual history of modern Europe, is a fine example of the second kind of 18th century conjectural history. For the early period, they used philosophers' accounts of human nature. They drew individual data points from travelers' reports of primitive peoples as they were known. And for later periods, as I said, they could draw on a much wider range of materials. And it really is quite a wonderful range of material. I think there's no doubt that it is at the origins of the modern social sciences, at the origins of modern materialist understandings of history, and much more. I would only quarrel with one word in Dugald Stewart's description, and that's peculiar, because I'm not sure why the 18th century interest in conjectural history is really so peculiar. And though this is a technical point about genealogy and could easily and may well be rejected as typical pedantry, I would argue that it's significant that if any field needs to have its genealogy in good shape, it's surely conjectural history, which was, among other things, a critique of accepted genealogies. More particularly, most practitioners of conjectural history and most of its modernist students have seen it as a break with rhetoric. History of the kind that they had abandoned and turned against was dominated by rhetoric. It included speeches written to rhetorical canons. It tried to carry out the tasks of rhetoric, of history as determined by rhetoricians. If, in fact, somehow some individuals got off the sinking ship of rhetoric and managed to get into the rising one of conjectural history, that's a significant point and tells us that this is a different movement than we've thought. Now, work has already been done to some extent. Italian scholars, Francesco Lo Monaco is a wonderful philologist, Giuliano Mori is a really terrific historian, have identified at least one landmark in early modern historiography that Smith and Dugald Stewart might have identified as they peered back into the mists of pre-modern ignorance as someone who was doing things that would have been of interest to him. And that, of course, is Valla. And the reason for this is not simply that Valla was a kind of critical, provocative historian in their own spirit, or perhaps they were in his. It's also because conjecture played such a central part in Valla's work. In the first instance, as a student and teacher of rhetoric, he was infinitely familiar with the so-called status system, the classificatory system according to which speeches will normally address three kinds of question: conjectural, did it happen? Definitional, what happened? And qualitative, what kind of happening was it? And these, any rhetoric course given anywhere in the Renaissance would have taught and exemplified these principles. The conjectural status, as teachers always emphasized, was the central one. It was the main one. It was the one that orators most often practiced. There were only so many orations you could give in praise of the beauty of the fig tree, but there was an infinite number of legal cases and historical debates and other arguments about the past, which called for the exercise in school, as Quintilian already makes clear, or in actual public life, for the conjectural status. And as Quintilian insists, and as we've seen, this is, or at least is supposed to be, a critical form of utterance. It's supposed to be a form of utterance in which there is a real effort to use evidence. Valla couldn't always resist the temptation to do the other sort of rhetoric. Whoever heard of a Phrygian tiara in Latin? Though you talk like a barbarian, you apparently want me to think this is the language of Constantine. And there are pages and pages of this sort of thing in the Oratiuncula. But Valla did other things under this heading as well. For example, he wrote a long pamphlet in which he showed that Livy had made a mistake in the genealogy of Tarquinius Priscus. And when he was challenged by one Benedetto Morandi, of whom he said, as Gibbon does of his critics, someone whom I have not the honor to know, Morandi accused him of lying on of heresy for attacking a great ancient and lying about his own work. And Valla, in his reply, said, "I left no stone unturned while writing in the conjectural status, as everybody does, and this man calls me a liar." So Valla was very clear about the genre that he practiced, and he's clear in public as well as in his teaching about its possible provocative applications, as when he says in an unnoticed passage in the Donation of Constantine lecture, "The entire issue turns on the story of Sylvester, and for me it will be fitting above all to speak about the Roman pontiff, so it will be easy to draw conjectures about the rest from this one example." So for Valla, the conjectural status was a mine of critiques that could be leveled not at Christianity, as used to be thought, but at the church. Mrs. Gray always used to say that she thought of Valla as an Anglican churchman, very well informed, but likely to go off like a hand grenade as soon as somebody challenged a single well-established doctrine or practice. So Valla definitely sees his work on the past not as history. He never claims that it's history. It's critical work about the past, and the term for that is practicing the conjectural status. But he also talks about conjecture in another sense. Morandi accused him of plagiarism. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the Greek historian of Rome, advanced the same criticism of Livy's genealogy that Valla did. And Valla was perhaps more infuriated by this than by anything else. And so he says, if anyone thinks that I who, as it were, divined many things that are in Dionysius, that I had read this author, he'll be someone who doesn't know me very well. Now, in this case, Valla is using divination, which can just be a synonym for conjecture, but isn't always just that. I think more in the sense that Ginsburg wrote about in his great article on Freud, Morelli, and Sherlock Holmes. This is the brilliant flash of insight, which is difficult or impossible to account for by rational means, but which is a vital part of practice in the humanities and in the less quantitative social sciences. So for Valla, in other words, conjecture was both a genre and a practice. It was both a way of writing about the past that enabled you, instead of telling stories, to engage in full-scale argument that involved the serious consideration of evidence, and it was one of the scholarly practices in which he engaged. Valla did not make many conjectural emendations as a critic. He was really much happier using manuscripts for variants than he was changing the readings of text. So, though he does occasionally use conjecture or divine in that sense, it's more normally in this historical sense that it appears. So you would have thought that Valla might have found a little bit of a place in what we used to call forerunners. We don't do predecessors, all those terrible beings who've been banished from our histories anyhow. But of course he didn't. More important, perhaps, than that is another point. Valla was not doing anything especially new, though he was doing what he did extremely well. This kind of use of the conjectural status and conjecture was already fairly well established in his intellectual world when he entered it actively in the 1430s. So I'm going to explore briefly, I promise, 3 different places and moments in early modern Europe where you can see the conjectural mode being applied to past topics and different points emerging. So come with me far from frozen Glasgow and chilly Edinburgh to Florence in the 1430s. Here we are at the great Dominican Basilica of Santa Maria Novella. It's the center of an intellectual revolution. This is where Masaccio has painted in the 1420s his Trinity fresco with its brilliant demonstration of the principles of Brunelleschi's perspective. In the 1430s, it's where Uccello is painting some of his frescoes in the Green Cloister, including this wonderfully seductive devil from the Adam and Eve that he was actually painting right when Pope Eugenius IV arrived, having been driven out of Rome by a mob of angry Roman citizens to spend what turned out to be 10 years in Florence. The popes, when in Florence, lived in Santa Maria Novella, and Eugenius did exactly that. He lived in the Great Cloister. That's the corridor that you can see. It used to be called the Florentine Lateran because the Pope spent so much time there even before Eugenius. Only one room survives, and that's the room on the far right, which is the now known as the Cappella dei Papi, and they show it to you because it's got amazing Pontormo frescoes, especially on the ceiling. But it was then the Pope's bedroom. And the intellectual revolution I'm talking about took place right outside the Pope's bedroom in the auditorium chamber, where the papal secretaries gathered. These men were an extraordinary group of scholars and more, erudite, eloquent, extremely malicious. They called their gatherings the Budala, the lie factory. And they told jokes, they told stories, they played humiliation games, and they argued about scholarly topics, one of which would not leave them alone once it had been raised by Leonardo Bruni. And that was, what language did the Romans speak? This was a question that they found really difficult. Did ordinary Romans, poor Romans, plebeian Romans in the general modern rather than the formal Roman sense of plebeian, could they understand the language of Roman literature? Could they understand what Cicero or Virgil talked about? What did they speak? Did they speak the same Latin as Cicero, or did they speak some sort of jargon that shared words with it, but no grammar and no syntax? Now, these arguments harked back, of course, to medieval debates about the Vulgata and Latin, to Dante's and many others' work on those subjects, but they also addressed a keen modern problem. Humanists wanted to speak and write classical Latin. They saw classical Latin as the most powerful and effective language that had ever existed. They saw it in Vala's terms as a sacrament, the outward sign of inward grace. And they were desperate to be able to practice it with perfection. But that wasn't easy, because they had the ingrained habits of people who hadn't grown up writing classical Latin, no Jesuit schools to teach them at this stage. So they were likely, when writing a letter, to call themselves we and be scolded because Cicero had called himself I. They were likely to spell things wrongly. Is the Latin word for nothing nihil, N-I-H-I-L, or nihil, N-I-C-H-I-L? You might think this is much ado about nothing, but there were actually arguments on both sides. So the difficulty was, how could you be classical? There was always the possibility of mistake. And mistake, if you did it, brought humiliation. And now, E.H. Gombrich showed long ago in a wonderful essay that this was really not trivial. This was a new cultural style, as serious as the new style of an Oscar Wilde or of dandies of another kind. But new styles take a lot of energy and effort to maintain. And in this one, there were a lot of humanists seeking preferment and hoping to get it partly by showing that their colleagues were unable to keep their side up in writing and speaking this kind of Latin. So when Poggio Bracciolini fell out with Lorenzo Valla, Valla wrote, among other things, a dialogue in which his cook and stable boy, both of whom were German and therefore barbarians, read Poggio's prose aloud and punctured its errors one after another for 20 pages. And this is the origin of the German mot Küchenlatein, kitchen Latin. Actually comes from this. And this meant that this Latin was a kind of unattainable beauty. What could you do? Well, you could write something and give it to a learned friend. Poggio wrote things and gave them to his friend Niccolò Niccoli, member of a great Florentine family, savagely self-critical, so he never actually wrote anything himself. But he was happy to deal with the writing of others. And he basically dealt with them as the schoolmaster is dealing with the schoolboy. Poggio would send him a text, and Niccoli would say nothing for 6 months. Then it's really like sending a dissertation chapter to your supervisor. And we all know what that's like. Then Poggio would write, did you get my piece? And then Niccoli would write back saying, well, there's nothing wrong with it but the style and the content, and put him through a bruising critique, only to inform him at the end that his work really belonged in the outhouse rather than in the study. Now, given what it took to become a renowned Latinist, imagine how hard it was to think not only that Rome was full of them, but Rome was full of renowned Latinists who were butchers and bakers and tailors and housewives and seamstresses. Yet that seemed to be the implication, if indeed they had all been able to understand and actually speak and manage classical Latin. Bruni started the debate orally. We don't have what he said, but I can reconstruct a bit of it. Bionda wrote a reply, which is the first piece to survive from these debates, and the debates went on and on. There are some wonderful collections of these texts with good commentary by Mirko Tavoni and others. Now, how did you do this? Well, You needed evidence, didn't you? So Bruni and Biondo go looking for evidence. For example, in On the Orator, Cicero has a passage in which he talks about the Roman habit of contracting names. What greater license could be taken than contracting people's names to make them more compact? For as they said, duellum for bellum and duis for bis, so they called the Duellius who defeated the Carthaginians with his fleet Bellius, though his ancestors had always been called Duelli. Now, Biondo here makes clear that Bruni quoted this as evidence that the ordinary Romans had spoken improperly. He does so with a nice military metaphor. The first troop that your army had arrayed against us was that the ignorant people among the Romans pronounced the word spoken as duellum in Latin as bellum. And he then goes on to argue that, in fact, Cicero is just talking about the freedom with which Romans spoke and the need for an orator to accept this freedom, however learned he was, if he wanted to be understood and effective with a Roman audience. So Cicero is describing not a popular error or a flaw in colloquial Latin, but a genuine colloquial way of speaking shared by uneducated and cultured Romans. And the really important bits from my standpoint are not who's right, which is endlessly complicated. And of course, they didn't have any of the good evidence. They didn't have a single graffito, for example. So they couldn't possibly be really right about this. But the language they use, because what Biondo says is, you said it could be conjectured from this, hinc cognici possa dixisti, that the Roman people, that the learned people differed from the vulgar. And he, after some argument, says, in my view, it is not possible to make from this the conjecture that bellus was vulgar or duellus literary. So notice the terminology. It seems entirely clear that what Bruni made was a conjectural argument in which he quite explicitly took the evidence that he had and made conjectures from it. And in doing that, he was really doing a kind of novel exercise. Ancient history doesn't really have very much space for this kind of argument. It's not something you'll find in the narrative histories from the ancient world or the medieval world that they read. And what Bruni had suggested and Biondo had developed was the idea that this sort of exercise in the conjectural mode could be a way of approaching questions about the past for which history itself didn't have any space. And it could be very effective. Now, Biondo argues that Bruni makes bad conjectures. Bruni, older and much more famous. You've all seen his wonderful tomb in Santa Croce. This was a man with a belly. He naturally replied, and in a similar key, emphasizing that the argumentative value of each piece of evidence was the point at issue. The problem was Biondo didn't understand them. For example, Biondo said, central Latin texts imply the existence of a single language world. The comedies, for example, why would ordinary people go see Terence and Plautus if they couldn't understand the actors? Or Cicero's speeches and the other speeches of orators. Bruni says, this just isn't a good argument. These considerations seem to you the most solid of evidence. On your view, they constitute the surest of arguments. But I consider this no more powerful evidence than it would be today to observe that the gospel and mass are recited to the mob of listeners in literary Latin. They understand it, though they're illiterate, but they don't speak that way, and they don't know how to speak that way, though they understand it. It's a lot easier to understand a foreign language than to speak it. Let us then, by your leave, discuss your arguments and examine their value, for it's more fitting to assent to arguments based on necessary reasoning than to those based on signs and opinions. And it is quite typical of conjectural historians that their conjectures are plausible conjectures based on good inferences from facts, whereas the opponent's conjectures are weak conjectures that should have been strong arguments in the first place. So what we have here is conjectural historians or conjectural students of the past in confrontation. They found a clear model for their work. in an ancient text from the rhetorical tradition. And I think that also not only is typical of this world of conjectural historians, it's also very typical of the way in which humanists build up novel approaches in the 15th and 16th centuries. You take a classical source, but then you do something creative with it. And so the text in question is one that these men knew intimately. Cicero's Brutus, his dialogue about the development of oratory, which was found together with the orator in Lodi in 1421. That manuscript has been lost, as the humanists so often manage to do. The oldest manuscript we have is the one from which these are the colophons, written by Biondo Flavia. He sent it to Bruni, who needed to borrow it at one time. So this is a text which is very much in the world of these men, and it's widely discussed and widely read. If you haven't read the Brutus, which I earnestly recommend, Cicero portrays what should be a conversation among three Romans, Cicero himself, Marcus Brutus, and Titus Pomponius, except that Cicero does almost all of the talking. Perhaps not a surprise. He passes every Roman rhetorician in review with a sentence or two for each. It's a bit like the short movie reviews in the New Yorker. And one difficulty is that for many of them, that's all we know about the rhetorician, which hasn't stopped Roman historians from making big hypotheses. But sometimes he doesn't have evidence. He's read immensely widely. He, of course, had a magnificent library, and he had read very widely, but sometimes there was nothing to read. For example, with the Republican politicians of the 3rd century BCE, there was simply no textual legacy from them. Accordingly, he said, I have to infer. I can't recall ever reading that these men were considered orators, or that there was then the least reward for eloquence. I'm only led by conjecture to suspect it. So Cicero himself is making an argument in the conjectural mode whenever he doesn't have what he calls monuments, sources to go on. And in the way that he puts them together, he's also going in the conjectural mode. He has some ideas about why rhetoric flourishes in Rome, for example. And at some points, the conjectures really pile up. My favorite is what's probably the most famous passage in the Renaissance from the Brutus. Cicero says, I think rhetoric must have taken a long time to develop. Sculpture took a long time, and he cites sculptors. Painting took a long time. And then he says, the same would probably turn out to be true in all other areas, for nothing has ever been both discovered and perfected all at once. Now, he obviously felt a little bit fragile with that, so he goes on to say, well, there's no warrant for doubting that there were poets before Homer, as implied by the songs he records being sung at the feasts of the Phaeacians and the sailors. So one conjecture builds on another conjecture. I remember Glenn Most playing Niccolo Niccoli and telling me not to do this many years ago when we were both young. So the Brutus is it's steeped in conjecture itself. Was it a history? Bob Castor, whose beautiful translation of the work with a wonderful commentary I've relied on for understanding it, says that it's clearly not a history because he really doesn't spend much time on why rhetoric develops in Rome. It's a descriptive rather than an explicative text. But that, I think, is exactly what the conjectural status was for. It was for telling a story, establishing what had happened. And that seems to me to be exactly what Cicero is doing in the Brutus, and it's certainly how my humanists take him. And there are other comparisons one could make. I'll just point very quickly to this one because I want to get on. Cicero is willing to make big conjectures. He's willing to conjecture that there were whole generations of rhetoricians that he can't document. He's willing to conjecture that there were poets before Homer. And Biondo, similarly, here makes a conjecture that all Romans for the first 1200 years of the existence of Rome could speak and understand Latin, and that the barbarians had not, in fact, damaged competence in the language, even in the late antique period. He would later change his mind about this history and make the period of good Latin last even longer until the Lombards ruined everything. But what you see here is what he says that I think is so revealing is, I am induced chiefly by conjecture. Just like Cicero, when he makes a big bet, he tells you he's making a bet, he's making a conjecture, and that's all he can, and that's all the evidence he can manage to do. This is very popular writing. We have annotated copies of Biondo's works, and it's clear that his readers were very enthusiastic about his ability to characterize a culture and its development over time. They found this something really novel and attractive. So when Valla charged into the always controversial world of ecclesiastical history, trailing conjectures to right and to left, he was entering a landscape where this set of maneuvers was anything but unfamiliar. Let's move to a place where changes were taking place more radical than anything that ever occurred in Renaissance Florence, and that's saying something. To the Hispanic Atlantic of the 16th century, a world of warfare, demographic collapse in the Americas, and many, many other radical developments. Through the 1570s and 1580s, José de Acosta, a Jesuit from Medina del Campo, was carrying out the most extraordinary life of exploration you could imagine. He spent several years in the Andes, chiefly at Tuli, the little Rome of the Andes, as it was called, where the Jesuits built several churches. That's the nicest of them. That was also the church where they established the first press for the Aymara language. He was also the official historian of the church in Peru and the official note taker for the Third Council of Lima. Then he left for the Valley of Mexico, where he also had a very distinguished career, again, collecting information about the history of New World peoples. He did a lot of collecting with another Jesuit, Juan de Tovar. I don't have a picture of Juan de Tovar. The picture on your right is not him, but it is a leaf from an extraordinary calendar and account of Mesoamerican religion that he compiled with indigenous sages. He spoke Nahuatl. He could, to some extent, understand these codices, and though this is a hybrid post-conquest codex, it's a really remarkable piece of work, and really one of the great works of scholarship produced in this world, by this collaborative method. In 1579, Acosta was ordered home. He went back to Europe, where he became the head of various Jesuit colleges, including the Roman one. And he published a number of books, of which one is by far the most important. It appears in two forms. On the Nature of the New World, which is two books really arguing about the possibility of writing a history of the New World, and then The Natural and Moral History of the Indias, which engorges that first book to provide a much larger, richer, more vivid history of the New World, so far as Acosta believed that was possible even to do. The first book is written in Latin, the second book is written in Spanish, but they're largely aligned on most technical and polemical issues. Early on, Acosta says that he has a dramatic conjecture to make. There must be a land bridge connecting the Americas to some part of the Old World. He has a nice set of period arguments why this must be true. There has to be some way in which animals and humans arrived in the Americas. He could imagine that there had been voyages, though he found it a little difficult to believe that ancient seamen had been able to cross the Atlantic. But he particularly could not see why foxes, wolves, and other nasty creatures had made it to the New World. Why would anybody take them? No one would, and they couldn't swim. So we need another explanation. Again, the argument itself is of less consequence than the way in which Acosta speaks of it. This discourse, he says, that I have spoken is for me a great conjecture to think that the New World, which we call the Indies, is not completely divided and separated from the other world. And to state my opinion, I have held for some time that the one land and the other are joined and connected at some point, or at least that they approach one another fairly closely. So here, Acosta has actually sort of turned the history of humanity in the world on its head on the basis of a conjecture. It's quite a radical step to take linguistically as well as intellectually. Now, Acosta's first version of it also included this conjecture, but there he calls it simply a non-trivial conjecture, non levis conjectura. And it's striking to me that when he translates the book, he translated his own work from Latin into Spanish. He says he did it for people who were not as learned as the readers of the Spanish. So it seems clear that he felt it was necessary to situate what he was doing in a way he didn't have to do for an erudite reader, but he did have to do for readers who might not have gone through a Jesuit school and learned their rhetoric. At any rate, here we have quite an extraordinary change. We have conjectural history being done, and it's argued for at great length, I can assure you, in the body of the history. So for Acosta, he's willing to sacrifice the ornamental part of rhetoric in order to keep the conjectural part as a component of his historical work. Now, Acosta's an extremely critical writer, and he has to deal with the fact that there were many other theories of all sorts about the movement of peoples and individuals in this biblical world. Here, for example, is that of Benito Arias Montano, the editor of the magnificent Antwerp Polyglot Bible. And may I recommend to you The Multiplicity of Scripture, a magnificently erudite book by Theodor Dunkelgrün, which began as a dissertation in the Committee on Social Thought, and which does justice to that incredible work of scholarship. It's just an extraordinary thing. So Montano is in charge of this, reading the proofs, writing notes in Hebrew to his co-workers, editing it, and providing commentary. And in the commentary, he makes an argument that attracted Acosta's attention. He argues that Ophir, which in the Bible is the land rich in gold to which Solomon's ships went to get gold for the temple, was actually Peru. The basis of the argument was linguistic. There was a clear inversion of letters. This is, of course, a standard period way of tracing genealogies and geographies and popular movements. There's nothing funny about it in period. It's perfectly normal. What is striking to me about it is the way in which he puts it. For what he says is the two Perus, and I'm not going to go into why there were two Perus and two Ophirs. You don't need to know that, but anyone who wants to, I can tell. The two Perus, he says, retained their proper names, Ophir, down to the time of Solomon and after. But a little later, each name was inverted and attached to a different place, and each place was called Peru. So there's no mention of conjecture, and there's no mention of conjecture anywhere in Montano. This is argument based on the Bible. For him, this is rigorous argument which cannot be refuted by any form of evidence of which he is aware. Acosta was not convinced, to say the least. And in a wonderful reply, he argues, basically, he suggests elegantly that Montano was making conjectures and they weren't very good ones. If conjectures and guesses are worth anything, mine are that in Holy Writ, the words Ophir and Tarshish often don't mean any particular place. They're of general meaning to the Hebrews, just as in our vulgar language, the word Indies is general for the many Indies in our usage and language. It simply means lands that are very far away and very rich and very different from our own. So we Spaniards indifferently call Peru and Mexico the Indies, and China and Malacca and Brazil. So here you have Acosta not only in some way acknowledging that conjecture was a legitimate approach to times this ancient and periods this ancient, but that the kind of dogmatism that he found in Montano and many others was actually not an improvement. He's really, I think, arguing for the superiority of conjectural reasoning and probabilistic reasoning. Now, he's not the only such writer in his world, and I just want to briefly look at one more, Ambrosio de Morales, who is a contemporary of these men and who becomes the Spanish royal historian, who's assigned to complete the great Crónica Florian de Ocampo's chronicle of Spanish history by the monarchy. Morales is a humanist, he's a historian, and he is a kind of person we haven't really talked about much yet, though Biondo was another. He was an antiquarian. He was somebody who collected, as we'll see in a moment, inscriptions and other forms of material evidence, and who tried to use them to work out which cities in the Spain that he knew were Roman cities, which was very difficult. Spain had had the great interruption of barbarian invasion and then Islamic conquest. Antiquities had moved, they'd been battered. It was very, very difficult to tell this story if you were a rigorous kind of a scholar. And Morales was a rigorous kind of a scholar. Here you see him really trying to reproduce an inscription with all of its faults, as the booksellers say, all of its imperfections. And he is somebody whose care has been, really revived by Will Stenhouse and others who've been writing the history of antiquarianism in a new way in recent years. So, what do you do if you're Morales and you have to write a chronicle of Spanish history, which has St. James and which has lots of other stories that have absolutely no foundation whatsoever, and which has the descendants of Noah coming, thanks to Annius of Viterbo, into Spain, and on and on? Well, what you do is you write two books. You write the Crónica, which is the traditional history, and you write a second book called Antigüedades, in which, as an honest antiquarian, you do your best to raise the problems and discuss them. The Antigüedades actually begins with a discourse in which he offers 13 different kinds of evidence and the strengths and weaknesses of each, constantly interspersing cautions. I'm inquiring about something that by its very nature cannot be known with absolute certainty. Moreover, it's shrouded in the deep darkness of old age and oblivion, where, when reason manages to form a reasonable conjecture, that is all that can be expected, and nothing more should be hoped for. So, he's very much on the same lines as Acosta, insisting that that in some sense, all history of ancient times has to be conjectural history, has to be probabilistic, and has to in some way incorporate arguments because it's probabilistic. But at the same time, he recognizes that it would be wrong to try to put them in a history. As he says, this method of treating antiquities, and by the way, I'm not unaware that antiquarianism and conjectural history in my formulation often have in their Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap, and that's certainly true, is that this method of treating antiquities is a form of plain, very clear, and utterly simple exposition without any embellishment in the language, and it stands in stark contrast to history, which demands gravity and elegance in its expression, so that by adding the truth, making it more palatable and comprehensible, it may be worthily adorned and embellished with majesty. In other words, you can't do conjectural history and narrative history between the same set of covers. It's just not going to work. Morales, for all his really strong passion for rigorous and careful argument, nonetheless does not believe that you can challenge the hegemony of rhetoric. That's what shows how remarkable or distinctive Acosta is. He is one of the earliest writers, I think, to make a systematic effort to integrate conjectural and antiquarian kinds of argument with narrative history. And that may explain why his book excited Francis Bacon and many other readers, went into many, many translations and editions. Final, very quick trip to Paris. It's Paris. We're going to the study of Isaac Casaubon, great humanist scholar. He lived there from 1600 to 1610. He spent most of his time working in the French Royal Library, which he loved, but in a miserable subordinate job, which he hated, with an incompetent old man running the library. But he did find time. Now, Casaubon could always find time to do anything. He was an incredible Schwerarbeiter, and he found time to do an edition of Polybius, which is one of the great philological and historical works of the 16th and 17th centuries, a book that has an enormous reputation for its long and eloquent introduction and for the quality of the text he established, all of which is quite deserved. Now, Casaubon really sets his book up as a kind of remedy for an approach to history that had been popular in a powerful way just before his own time. The writers of the Artes Historicae, men like Jean Bodin, had tried to make history more instructive by making it rigorous, by providing instructions for how to read it critically, and by showing how to judge historians, and then by showing how to build generalizations about history, global as well as national, from their work. And Casaubon thought that they were, or at least thought that Bodin was a wild incompetent. That's Bodin's book, The Textual Greenland of Its Day, entitled Method for the Easy Comprehension of History. It's one of those Vietnam books from the 16th century. You get in, but you can't get out. At any rate, Bodin here argues, and Casaubon in his preface to Polybius berates him, that the real key to history is numerology. He'd tried astrology. He had tried he had tried other forms of divination. He had tried Hebrew prophecy. But what he finally came down with was Platonic numerology. 496. 496. Not the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, but it is the key to all historical knowledge. For 496, as Plato had noted, is an interesting number. It's the third perfect number, and it marks, for Plato, the longest duration that an empire or state can have. So it is the key to history because it tells you, at the very least, when disaster is going to come. And you see Casaubon saying, shame on that politicus, that political specialist, who, though he wished to seem a Christian, offered such a ridiculous verdict on the causes of the transformation of empires. So what does Casaubon do? Well, like everyone from Machiavelli on who got the chance, he hurled himself on Polybius. Machiavelli, like others, read a kind of samizdat Latin translation of Book 6, which was circulating in manuscript. Casaubon confronted the whole book. His working copy still survives. It's so heavily wreathed with annotation that the Bodleian calls it Manuscript Casaubon 19. And you can, and the title page is pretty, actually that's fairly lightly annotated. The notes get heavier thereafter. So Casaubon takes Polybius and he works his way through the text line by line, word by word, showering it with his erudition. It's an extraordinary performance. Just anywhere you go in, when he comes to the Roman funeral ceremony, for example, there's a long question. Were the masks that Romans wore colored, or were they hung up on racks with tituli above them to identify them? After a considerable amount of debate, he decides they were colored. And the whole thing is like that way, full of antiquarian information, philological information, information about everything from ciphers to military tactics. It's just extraordinary. But the main thing that he reads, that he finds as he reads, that excites him as he keeps reading, is something that he sums up in the preface. History trains us with an art that is not worthless to practice a very innocent kind of divination. And what does he mean by divination? Well, history obviously tells you to understand, that is, reading history by someone like Polybius teaches you to understand events in your time as in his. And you can see Casaubon working with Polybius's commentary and drawing implications from them. By insensible degrees, the monarch becomes a king, ferocity and force having yielded the supremacy to reason. Casaubon, going off at 90 degrees, but an interesting 90 degrees, note the chances that take place in the state or the church escape notice as they are happening. So he's engaged in a kind of dialogue with Polybius throughout. And the thing that most strikes him is Polybius's claim, which he thinks is valid, to be able to predict history. So, of course, the core of Book 6, as everybody here knows, as Machiavelli found, is the point where Polybius goes through the cycle of 6 constitutions. Monarchy becomes tyranny, aristocracy becomes oligarchy, democracy becomes ochlocracy, and shows that this is the regular cycle of constitutional revolutions. If a man have a clear grasp of these principles, he may perhaps make a mistake as to the dates at which this or that will will happen, but he'll rarely be mistaken as to the stage of growth or decay at which it has arrived. We could all use a bit of this form of divination right now, I suspect. And Casaubon comments, note, a certain divination must be made about the changes of republics. This is a theme that he follows both in his marginal notes. Polybius foresees the future role of the crowd at Rome, and on the title page, which is always where Casaubon likes to set up the big lessons of his books, a divination of the future overthrow of the Roman Republic. So for Casaubon, you're not going to learn how to think about history from reading moderns who tell you about how to put histories together. You'll learn from Polybius, because Polybius, the greatest of conjectural historians in antiquity, conjectured, and his conjecture was verified by later history. So this is rigorous as conjectural knowledge can be. He doesn't, of course, call it conjecture. He calls it divination. And that's significant because divination is a complex word in this period. It can refer to witchcraft. It can refer to other illicit pursuits. It can refer to astrology. But it can also refer to textual correction, the kind of correction that you make when the manuscripts give you no help. Just as conjectural history is what you write when you don't have documents, conjectural emendation is what you do, divinatory emendation is what you do when you don't have evidence, when you have to have a flash of insight that lets you fill in. And Casaubon himself was a great admirer of his friend Joseph Scaliger for his ability to come up with what he calls in this note on one of Scaliger's books now in Eton, a brilliant divination and clearly divine. He's a great admirer of this. Divination is for him, I think, a form of conjecture which has a kind of extra brilliance. It comes from an extra distance from any kind of foundation, and it gives you unexpected results, rather as Polybius can give you unexpected results about his future. And again, he uses this term of divination for the political art that really learned people can gather from Polybius and others. So right at the bottom there, he has some very interesting notes on the fall of Rome in the Bibliothèque Nationale, where he talks about, is it religion that caused Rome to fall? Is it this? Is it that? And finally, when he's happy, he says, this is that divination carried out by prudent men, which authors mention everywhere. So for Casaubon, conjectural or divinatory history is a history that is future-oriented, a history that predicts. And I don't need to remind anyone here that conjectural history was always that too, that the stadial histories and divinations of Smith and others were always future-oriented as well as past-oriented. One last point, as always, the story is a little more complicated, as it turns out that some of this reading of Polybius goes back through François Baudouin, another of the artists of history who had come up with a rather similar reading of Polybius in 1560. And as Baudouin says, there was that Florentine, what was his name, who used Polybius. He had some of these ideas. It's just now we're looking at a wider range of history, so we can do this more rigorously. What I love about Baudouin is his summary, qui bonus historicus bene conjecet. A good historian makes good conjectures. Here you have a real revisioning of history. Conjectural history is an art whose point is turned to the future. Is it important that conjectural history has these earlier roots? I think it is, because I think there's a different story here. It's a story about the rhetorical tradition, which turns out to be more implicated in modernity than we've been given to think. It's a story about the classical tradition, because again and again, there's a Brutus or a Polybius involved in these writings. Ancient texts turn out to be tools of a new form in this context, which can be used in really novel and striking ways. And finally, you get from this a sense that conjecture and history are a kind of living argument that goes over centuries. One question, well, many questions remain. My big question, and I'd be delighted if anyone has an answer for this, is what Smith and the others thought they were doing when they pretended none of this had happened. Think about Adam Smith. He was a professor of rhetoric. He had an excellent classical education at Glasgow, whose graduates to this day despise classicists from Oxford and Cambridge as not really knowing their Greek. So the thought that he didn't know about the conjectural status is pretty implausible. So that's a small question. The interesting point, I think, is whether it can be argued, as I've tried to argue, that conjectural histories of many kinds are among the, shall we say, the peculiar glories of early modern classical scholarship. Thank you.
All right. What time is it? Okay, good. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Floor is open. Rainey, please speak it.
Thank you. Tony, thank you. That was non-paré. I have a question about the preconditions for this kind of conjecture working, and perhaps an explanation about its decline in the 19th century. It seems to work, and this is very true to the rhetorical tradition, on analogy. That is, it has to be comprehensible to your current audience, the reasoning of attributed to the past. So it suggests a kind of anti-historicism with respect to certain psychological preconditions. So Acosta's wonderful argument of who the hell would want to take a fox with them?
I mean, skunk, you should read on skunks.
Right, exactly. Right, exactly. Is self-evident to people who may shun foxes, but those who think about foxes as the first step to the domestication of dogs may have different views. So that would suggest, this is a conjecture, that historicism is deadly for this form of argument. Because if you continue to insist on the pastness of the past, to the point of insisting that psychology was different and many other commonplaces were different, this kind of argument begins to lose its sway. As I say, this is a conjecture. I also have a conjecture about why Adam Smith thought he was doing something different, but I'll save it for the reception.
Oh, I think he was doing something different. What's remarkable is the absence of a reference to the past, not the, no, he was doing something quite different. But first of all, on this, yes, one of the core methods in rhetorical hermeneutics is verisimilitude, and verisimilitude insists that you know what is likely to be true, and that's because you know how people behave, and so they will have behaved one way at one time and one way at another. So it should go that way, but it doesn't. Vala's history of Front of Aragon is a deliberate violation of all of the precepts of verisimilitude. He can use them when he wants to, but when he doesn't, he has the king, like our king, falling asleep at public meetings and all sorts of violations of decorum. And when he's challenged, he says, well, that's what happened. So I think actually the story is more complicated than you suggest. And the other thing I think is that I don't think conjectural history dies at all in the 19th century. It moves. And it becomes Darwinian evolution. It becomes Freud and Moses. It becomes lots of things which have a huge, huge popular impact. So as I always liked, I think I may have argued with you about Athanasius Kircher. Athanasius Kircher is a terrible historian. He's always wrong, just always wrong. But he helps Bernini design the Piazza Navona. Now, what would you like to have on your epitaph? He was always right, or Bernini thought he was an intelligent man and listened to him about how to set the obelisk monument up. I think I'd rather go for that one. So I think, I do think that, we can press this too far, but I don't disagree with you that I do think that 18th century conjectural history is also much more often very, very naive about psychology and its changes, even though they think they're not being naive. But I think that's really one of its features where it's really not very good at looking at itself. So in that way, I think that may continue. That may be a continuing legacy from my people. Think of that.
Thank you, Tony. That was characteristically brilliant. I have a question.
Of course.
You mentioned at one point that Polybius was the greatest of the ancient conjectural historians. And so I asked myself while I heard that, who are the others? And I don't think that there are any. I have no doubt that modern conjectural history goes back to rhetorical roots. I also have no doubt that in antiquity, history was intimately connected to rhetoric, but I don't see conjectural history within history. I see it in ancient rhetoric, in the ancient world. I see it in rhetoric. I see it in satire, in Lucian.
Yeah.
I see it in philosophy, in Democritus or in Epicurus.
In Aristotle.
In Aristotle. But it doesn't go into history, as far as I can tell. Why is it that in ancient history, the effect of rhetoric doesn't create conjectural history, and in the modern it does?
Well, they do think there's conjectural history in antiquity. I think, I don't know if it's fair to call it a confusion, but one of the basic things in 20th century history of ideas, one of the big questions was about primitivism in antiquity. And the texts that Boaz and his partner rounded up were all seen in my period as conjectural histories. So Lucretius is seen as a conjectural historian, Vitruvius is seen as a conjectural historian, and there were two historians whom they took as models, Thucydides in the Archaeology, which Valla translates as a conjectural history, making the terms as conjectural as you possibly can. And as Valla is the man whose Thucydides becomes Thucydides for much. I was quite surprised to find Hobbes following Valla. Hobbes normally goes right from the Greek, but the impact of Valla and that translation is so deep that even Hobbes tends to go that way. Now, obviously, a fruitful field for wild confusion is trying to work out the meaning of the terms for evidence in Thucydides. There's an enormous and not always rewarding secondary literature on that, from which I have learned a lot, but my guys didn't know any of that, so it's not really relevant to them. But they do see Thucydides as a conjectural historian. They also see Diodorus Siculus, whose introduction has, of course, for Tom Cole and many other people, been the huge source of discussions of cultural progress, primitivism, and so on. So those two are enough for them. They don't need more. And but I don't think most of them want more, because most of them don't want to put conjecture into history. That's what makes Acosta so remarkable, because he's actually trying to pull off a wedding of these two very different kinds of rhetorical approach to the past. So I agree with you. It's not part of historiography, but there are these cases which are big enough for them. The Thucydides in particular is really, really bulks large, and still does in the 18th century, where more than one of the 18th century conjectural historians cites Thucydides' analysis as exemplary. So, so in that sense, I think, it's there. My favorite place for it, if you really want to know where to find out about conjectural history, the great account of stadial development, which is a fragment, is, among other places, in Varro on farming, a book that every gentleman read. So you actually could not have an estate and not read ancient stadial history. I think that there's, I hear you and I don't disagree with you, which is a rare event in our 50 years of loving friendship. But I do think that for them, what fascinates me is the way they put these texts together. Because they don't cite one, they'll always cite two or three, and they clearly see them as if there's a kind of integral connection to them. And I think they see them as trying to use conjectural evidence to go back to the past. And that's the thing that brings them together.
Tony.
Heather.
Magnificent. I have, you could have predicted this question. So I'm so glad that antiquarianism raised its shadow in this Venn diagram. I'm just so struck by the fact that at the same time, 1430s-ish, in the same neighborhoods, Florence, Rome, and some other places, that some of these things are happening in concert with one another. And so my question, which is, you say more as you wish, how and why?
So I think one thing is just above all important here, it seems to me, is that if you're an intellectual, a humanist in the 14th, 15th, or 16th century, it's kind of natural to want to know how we got where we are and why we can't speak Latin anymore. and why we don't know what these buildings are and they're ruined anyhow, and so on. So I think that, in a sense, it's not surprising. I mean, this is Peter Burke made this point a long, long time ago. Just seeing historical distance as vividly as you did every day in Rome in the 14th century, it was kind of obvious to begin thinking, well, how did this happen? And quite evident that the textual record wasn't going to tell you very much of anything about that, the historical textual record. So you'd have to find something else. That's part of it. Another part is conjecture, because antiquarianism lives by conjecture. Biondo is always conjecturing in his antiquarian work because, as he says, he doesn't know which building is which. He has to work it out, and he's well aware that he's often going to be wrong. So that's part of his practice as well. And so it's not an accident that he has this fascination with using evidence that isn't explicitly aimed at the question he's solving to solve it. And it's what antiquarians do too. I remember, for some reason, I'm remembering Eric Cochrane. We were reading a letter of Machiavelli's in which he writes about sitting and gossiping with a couple of friends on the bench in front of a palazzo. And Eric looked up and said, "See, street corner society in Chicago." There's a way in which, conjecture is a necessary implement, and printing makes conjecture respectable. Because you may think, well, I have manuscripts, I don't really want to choose them. But by the 15th, 16th century, you're editing texts off printed Vorlagen that are full of mistakes. The proofreader, the typesetters give you lots more mistakes. So half of your time, anyone here is old enough to remember correcting real proofs and the wonderful things they came up with in them. So, you really, conjecture becomes more and more legitimate in the 16th century. You have to make conjectures. And even a great Florentine scholar, Pier Vittori, who in the 1530s is a real enemy of conjecture, by the end of his life, he's saying, no, we have to do this. There's no other way in which we can hope to restore these texts or restore these practices. So all of those things are part of it. I actually start, if this becomes a book, it will start with Boccaccio and Christine de Pizan, because one of the earliest conjectural histories of culture is Boccaccio's history of how female gods are actually the women who created all the implements of culture, like, cultivation and bread and so on. And then Boccaccio typically has a sort of crisis and says, but was this a good idea? Weren't we better off without all of this? And Christine de Pizan then takes his material, rewrites it much better, and says, Boccaccio, go stick your head in a pig. Of course, civilization is better than not having civilization, and that's thanks to women. It's a real argument about whether the conjecture of euhemerism can restore a past which is not to be found anywhere else. And of course, these are works that are very popular and widely read. So I think that there's something to be said for starting there before they have the real tools in place. And Boccaccio actually does do conjectures in textual criticism, so he is someone for whom that's an actor's category. But I think that you're right, and I'm trying to work out how to make all of these things come together, and I'm also trying to work out where to stop, and advice would be helpful. My favorite story that I found is the story of Sir Thomas Browne, William Dugdale, and the backbone of a grampus, a large marine animal. So Dugdale was writing a history of drainage. He was paid to do it by the company that was draining the fens to shift the Overton window and show that drainage was a good thing, because the fens had this great culture of their own where they knew how to be shepherds on stilts. Casaubon sees shepherds on stilts and says, wow, they're great. They're really good. And so you have to prove to people that the fens are no good, that it's just all covered with water and useless. And Dugdale set out to do that. And Dugdale is he's a document man. So he piles on the documents and looks at sites. But he also has to show that in antiquity, civilized peoples drained. And so he gets Thomas Browne's help, and Browne gives him help about Babylonian drainage and Roman drainage and Greek drainage and so on. But when it comes to the Grampus, they come to a parting of the ways. because there's this vertebrae of a marine animal found by Robert Cecil in his estate and treasured by the Cecils, and they finally give it to Brown, and Dugdale says, see, what, doesn't this prove something really important? Does this prove the universal flood? People were starting to doubt it. Or does this prove there was a local flood? And Brown is the author of Urn Burial. Brown says, yeah, things move and change in the earth. You have to be a little more careful than this. And at the end of his letter to Dugdale, he says, I can't even conjecture what kind of conjecture you're going to base on your conjecture. So that might be a good place to stop. But the 17th century is a real problem here, because the great Cambridge and other scholars who really revived the study of Scottish conjectural history, the only real source for it they look to is really 17th century legal and political thought, the state of nature, Pufendorf's history of property, and so on. And it seems to me that is precursoritis. There's no reason to assume that that is where what these guys are building on, rather than a wider and more vaguely known body of discussion with which they would have been familiar. But the 17th, and then there's always the great and frightening figure of Vico, who naturally is just there to terrify and confuse anybody who tangles with him. The entire Renaissance and Enlightenment on crack and in your face in one person. So that he seems like an obvious candidate for a book, maybe for the end of a book like this. Yet at the same time, I'm a little scared about that prospect. So I'll be grateful for any more questions, any more thoughts, any advice. Like, don't do it would be.
The land bridge discussion made me think that this is close, and I don't know if in the textual record conjecture is ever brought together with hypothesis in science. Conjectures seem to be hypotheses that have a very narrow scope, like it could just be a reading. On the other hand, of course, in this period, you mentioned the 17th century, Newton says hypothesis non fingo, so there is a clear effort to remove them or not to rely on them. And I thought the land bridge, of course, if he did more with it, it would be a hypothesis that would give rise to whole new, maybe even finding new information, or the Grampus. But I just wondered whether there's any point of bringing them together, or whether conjecture, Popper's book is called Conjectures and Refutations, because the idea is that conjectures are somehow local.
Yeah, no, these conjectures can be very big as the land bridge, as big as, how did Rome operate for 1,200 years? Those are fairly large size for humanities theories, call them that. They don't, in my experience, call them hypotheses, but I haven't looked enough in 17th century virtuosi where I'm sure that term comes in, as divination does in the 16th century. And so that's one of my open questions. Rainey, you're nodding.
John Pomata has written about this with regard to the medical literature in the 17th century.
Right. Yeah, so medical literature also in the 16th century is full of conjecture and probabilistic discussion. And astrological literature is full of conjecture and probabilistic discussion. And some of the humanists write in those fields, and many of them are familiar with them. So, I'm beginning to worry that this book, at times I'm reminded, if you know David Lodge's best book, The British Museum is Falling Down, where there's a graduate student who wants to write the history of plumbing in Victorian fiction. But before you can do that, you have to do Enlightenment plumbing. And before you do that, you have to do Renaissance plumbing. And he finally writes one chapter about prehistoric plumbing, which actually gets him the lectureship. So I'm afraid I might wind up with prehistoric conjecture. One more?
Well, maybe just
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I don't.
Yeah.
and then David, and that would be the last question.
Well, this is so following up on Glenn and maybe taking you back a little bit to the ancient conjectural history. What it was putting me in mind of was the kind of tradition of naturalistic and debunking interpretations of myth. And, you know, that, well, the centaur really, you know, there must have been a first time that somebody rode on a horse, and that must have struck people as looking like a single. And so that kind of debunking, and it's, so there is an emotional valence to this procedure. And that came up a little bit in some of the story you were telling, but I was just wondering how much of this sort of conjectural history is being set against kind of more mythological, or what are the aesthetic pleasures of that kind of history versus
that's a great question, and you know, absolutely on point. And I think that the you know, some euhemerism, you know, is often a sort of very rationalizing kind of, how could you be stupid enough to think that, you know, these things happened in the literal form. But, you know, it also has its temptations. You know, Bacon is a euhemerist of a really strange kind and seems to take that enterprise very seriously. The one thing I would say is that if you include that, then conjectural history blows up to immense proportions. If you know the wonderful book of Colin Kidd, The World of Mr. Casaubon, there was not a parsonage in England in the late 18th and early 19th century where the vicar wasn't writing Mr. Casaubon's Treatise to All Mythologies. It's just this incredibly rich and often wonderfully speculative, euhemerist, anti-euhemerist, everything is the Jews, no, everything is the Egyptians, on and on and on. And you could call that also a form of conjectural history, because it certainly is conjectural, and it certainly looks at the past. So I've been worried about that, but as Colin Kidd's book is so good, I think I might just leave it with that and a reference.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yes. So if you go back, I'm new to conjectural history entirely, but if you go back to some of the things that you said at the outset, and I guess a lot of the questions pursue this now at the conclusion, what really is the scope of conjectural history? I think that a question that I have really is, it seems that it is a common denominator is a search for something new. It's a way to get something new, either for refutational purposes, for purposes of discovery. If you have a problem that is not amenable to a clean empirical or historical solution. But if you then say, well, what is it that we're trying to define the scope of? What is conjectural history? Is it a methodology that's specific to history? Is it a methodology that's applied in history? And methodology really kind of takes you to this infinitely broad scope. So you kind of think, well, it's a search for something new, a new development. It may maybe have different forms for different subject matters, but if you wanted to become more rigorous about it, what would you say, how would you characterize conjecture as a methodology that can then be structured? Getting back to McKeon and the Common Core and his ideas and methods. How does methodology help you define both the scope and perhaps some of the properties of conjecture?
Method's tough because no two of these people actually agree when you press them on what the method of conjectural history is. But I would say there's a set of things that go together. One is you want to argue something about the past, and you need a genre to do it in because you don't have a genre. It's not what history does. It's not what commentary does. What is the genre? And the genre can be little treatises in epistolary form, like the ones about Rome, or orations, which is the most directly rhetorical form, as in Vala, or you can, as Acosta did, experiment with the rules for history itself. but you're trying to write something which it's not immediately obvious how you would do it. If you want to write about how bad things happen when a constitution goes pear-shaped, you just go back and read Sallust's Catiline, and then you say, okay, now I know how to write this. But you don't have a Sallust's Catiline for this stuff. And I think that is highly significant. That part of it is, it's unified by what it's not. It's not a history of Rome. It's a set of historical arguments about Rome. It's not a history of Spain, as Morales says. It's a set of arguments about the history of Spain, and that's negative, but I think it's still significant. It is. I also would never want to suggest that conjectural history is like a good thing. Conjectural history is used for many evil purposes. Acosta uses it to decide who's a barbarian and who isn't, for example. And he's not the first or the only one to do that, but it's hard to feel he's too pleased to find your guy doing that. And, a lot of conjectural history comes in the time of, European imperial and economic expansion, and is meant to portray that as a good and natural sort of consequence. When I was in Gen Ed, we had that awful book by Rostow, The Stages of Economic. Yeah, we were takeoff. We were made to take off with Rostow. And I think that's like the last blast of that kind of conjectural history. And we all hated it, I may say, including our teachers. As with Gen Ed, it was always the case in the old days that you never knew why you were reading anything. The staff didn't know why you were reading. The students didn't know why we were reading. And many great discussions about conjecturally trying to explain why we were reading a given thing or not. But so I think you need a way of addressing past issues that the existing genres don't really give you. And in many ways, Cicero's Brutus is kind of the closest thing to a full-blown work that is the sort of thing that conjecturalists want to do, though they don't often. There are some dialogues that actually try to do this, but beyond that, I'm leery of trying to define it too closely. I think my actors see it both as an identifiable kind of of genre or set of genres, a set of approaches, and as an identifiable set of practices. And I think that, in a way, the really interesting question is the one Rainey asks, is when does that stop? And one of the final points, I'll just look at, last point is, the other thing is conjectural history goes out with a blast. And this is a possible ending. I try to argue here that a lot of it comes out of philology. It comes out of teaching of classics, teaching of rhetoric, philological argument. At the end of the 18th century, two revolutionary books on the ancient world appear: Winckelmann's History of Greek Art, of Ancient Art, and Wolff's Prolegomena to Homer. They're both conjectural histories. They are both richly informed by the reading that they had done in both the scholarly traditions and the new traditions of philosophical history writing. And they completely blow classics and ancient history and aesthetics and many other things into pieces. So that might be a nice, if for a ring composition, it might be nice to start in humanism and end in or perhaps the last great humanist efforts at a kind of conjectural history. But that's just one thought. At any rate, thank you. It's a hard question. I do think about it a lot. If I had more and better answers, I would not deny you them.
On that note, I think Tony's more than earned his glass of wine. So I just want to say thank you.